She entered the silent house smelling of rye and dust, carrying a wounded heart and bread still warm from dawn. The air inside felt abandoned, as though breath itself had grown thin and cautious. Floorboards offered no protest under her weight. They had long surrendered to waiting. At the end of the hallway, a door hung half shut, guarding the room where time lay dwindling. Every few moments came a rasping inhale, a soft exhale, then the hush of someone who feared she might not manage another. Lydia Gray paused, letting her lungs map the gloom. Light fell in thin amber bars through slatted shutters, striping the parlor like jail bars across worn furniture. She set the loaf on the table, ran a hand along its crust to ground herself, then found the stove, dead cold, dull with neglect. A single match flared. Flame welcomed the iron belly, and the room shifted, shadows drawing back from orange heat, dust lifting as though unsure it was allowed to dance. In the sick room, Jacob Carver sat beside the bed, his shoulders square yet sunken, skin the color of unpolished silver. He spooned weak broth between his mother's lips, counting each swallow, measuring life in fractions. Lydia lingered at the threshold and watched, not intruding, simply witnessing the gravity that held them both. When Jacob glanced up, his eyes were pale and startled, as though waking to a stranger after a long drought of conversation. He nodded once. No words passed. A silent contract. She would try. He would let her. Lydia laid out linen, lavender water, and a small tin of salve that smelled faintly of honey. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, learned from years in places where words arrived too late to change anything. She dabbed the salve over cracked lips, cooled a fevered brow. Jacob shifted uneasy, then withdrew, as if the room no longer required his vigilance. In the corridor he lingered by the kitchen door, listening to the tick of warming metal, the hiss of kindling catching. Before long, the smell of bread thickened, weaving through the house, coaxing the walls to remember suppers once shared. Lydia noted every detail, the way the old woman's chest rose like wind against faded curtains, the tremor in her fingers, the slight softening of her jaw as the lavender reached her. She whispered nothing. Instead, she breathed in rhythm, lending calm through presence alone. Outside, evening settled, pressing mauve against the windows until darkness smoothed the prairie to ink. Later, in a corner room she had been given, Lydia unpacked her own small life: 2 dresses, a brush missing half its bristles, and a sketchbook with pages torn out where memories hurt too much. She placed the brush on the sill and opened the book to a blank leaf, letting emptiness sit beside her. Somewhere down the hall, boards creaked. Jacob pacing. She traced an invisible circle on the paper, then closed the cover. Healing, she knew, began in the quiet before anything was written. Morning bled slowly into the house. Jacob found the kitchen warm, the stove still alive, and Lydia kneading new dough with sleeves rolled, forearms dusted white. She did not look up when he froze in the doorway. Instead, she pressed her knuckles into the yielding mass, folded, pressed again, the rhythm steady as a heart returning to strength. The loaf from yesterday rested on the counter, half gone, crumbs like scattered seeds. He realized he had tasted bread the night before, first real food in weeks, though he could not remember standing to take it. Lydia set the dough aside to rise, washed her hands in a basin by the window. The water darkened briefly, then cleared. She glanced toward him, offering the slightest inclination of her head, an unspoken invitation to sit. Jacob remained upright, arms folded, eyes fixed on the loaf as if it might vanish. The impulse to thank her rose, but words felt brittle. He simply pulled out a chair and lowered himself, matching her silence with his own. Through the day, Lydia nursed the house as much as the bedridden woman. She opened shutters an inch, stirred dust into sunbeams, wiped corners where cobwebs had colonized. She hummed without voice, a cadence of subtle breath and footfall. Jacob shadowed her movements like a cautious dog, noting each change, linen flapping on a line that had not held wash in months, the scent of peppermint and water left by the bedside, the faint echo of a woman speaking to herself in the language of small tasks completed. At dusk, Lydia carried a rocking chair from the attic and set it on the porch. She oiled its joints, let it face westward. When the sun reached the horizon, Color spilled across the dry wheat like lantern light on metal. She sat, hands in her lap, watching until the last crimson strand slipped away. Behind her, Jacob hovered. He had not sat on that porch since his father's funeral, when the chair still rocked for someone alive. Lydia stood, gave the chair one gentle push, then stepped aside. The message was clear. Space waits for whoever claims it. An hour later, he found himself outside, coat draped loosely, listening to insects tune the night. The chair moved under him as though it remembered the shape of grief and offered not comfort, but acceptance. Inside, Lydia tended the stove, ensuring embers would last till dawn. She paused, noticing his silhouette beyond the glass, and allowed herself the softest breath of relief. Days layered quietly. Lydia learned the rhythm of the dying woman's breath, when to turn her, how to coax a spoonful more. She combed thin hair, trimmed brittle nails, whispered nothing, yet said much through the steadiness of her hands. Jacob hovered near doorways, carrying buckets, fetching wood, uncertain whether to resume a role he had long surrendered. Under Lydia's schooling glance, he began again, lifting his mother to change linen, reading her a verse from scripture, because her lips moved in silent memory. He fumbled at first, but the old woman's gaze clung to his like moss to stone, and he understood he was needed, not merely witness to decline. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the prairie, wind slapping shutters awake. Lydia moved through the house, securing latches, while Jacob held the door against a sudden gust. Thunder rattled joists, rain hammered clapboards with the fury of withheld tears. In the sick room, the old woman stirred, rasping for air. Candle flames shivered. Lydia pressed cool cloth to aged temples, whispered fragments of a lullaby whose language belonged to counties east of here. The wind rose, then fell, as though soothed by her song. When the storm passed, air smelled rinsed clean. New silence settled, deeper but kinder. Jacob stood in the doorway, watching Lydia tuck blankets around his mother. She glanced back. In that small light, he saw fatigue ghost her face. Shadows under eyes, a tremor in shoulders, not permitted rest. For the first time, he stepped fully into the room and placed a hand on her forearm. The touch startled them both. Skin meeting skin without transaction, only shared exhaustion. Lydia held his gaze, searching for judgment, finding none. She bent to adjust the pillow. He steadied her elbow. Night fell heavy, but Lydia did not sleep. She sat at the bedside, marking breaths against candle wax. Jacob lingered in the hall until the chair summoned him again. Outside, soaked earth released the scent of promise. He thought of hearths rekindled, of bread breaking crust beneath a knife, of rooms once closed now open. The sky cleared, stars crowding over the roof. The chair creaked under his weight, a slow lullaby. In her room, Lydia unwrapped a cotton bandage wound around her own wrist. Beneath lay a scar not yet silvered. She touched it, startled by tenderness, then rewrapped the bandage with practiced ease. Healing, she remembered, is not a straight road, but a porch light burning while storms rage. For now the light flickered steady. Bread rose again before dawn. Lydia timed the need to the old woman's breathing. Jacob, woken by scent, followed it like a child. He found Lydia at the table, palms pressed flat on the wooden surface in a moment of stillness. She lifted her head, offered half a smile, frail but real. He reached past her for a mug, poured water from the kettle, felt the heat bite his fingers, proof he was still living. Neither spoke. The silence between them had changed shape, once brittle, now pliant, capable of holding warmth. In the sick room, sunrise painted the quilts gold. The dying woman's chest rose with a sigh, almost content. Lydia straightened the blankets, smoothed a crease, then brushed stray hair from the brow. Jacob watched from the doorway, heart thudding with a rhythm he had forgotten belonged to hope. Outside, a single crow lifted from the fence post and sliced the sky, its cry sharp enough to wake the day. The morning crow's cry faded into a hush that seemed to wait for decisions. Jacob walked the perimeter fence, hammer in hand, resetting crooked posts one by one. Each strike echoed through brittle grass, a sound the prairie had not heard in months. Inside, Lydia washed bandages in warmed rainwater, fingers red from lye, eyes steady. The old woman slept, breathing shallow but even. When Lydia tipped the basin out the back step, she paused, steam rising, mud softening beneath bare feet. She pressed her toes into the earth as if testing whether it would take her weight, whether it would allow something to grow again. Jacob returned carrying a broken hinge he had pried off the barn door. He set it on the table, noticed the wrap on Lydia's wrist, and frowned. His glance was a question, hers, a dismissal. Yet later, when she reached for the kettle, the bandage slipped, and the scar flashed raw against lamplight. Jacob inhaled sharply, a sympathy that made her flinch harder than pain. She turned, busying herself with tea leaves. That evening, the bread cracked under his knife, crumbs soft as breath. He offered her the first slice. She shook her head, then stopped, meeting his eyes across the table's wide silence. They shared the piece, passing it hand to hand, no plates between. Crumbs clung to their fingertips like fragile confession. Wind shifted, carrying the chill memory of winter still curled in distant mountains. Lydia stoked the stove higher, then moved to the sick room. Jacob followed, hovering at the threshold until she motioned to a chair he had not sat in since boyhood. He obeyed. The lamp threw gold over quilt and bone. His mother's eyelids fluttered. A whisper escaped. Jacob. The name was barely formed, but the weight of it bent him forward, elbows on knees, head bowed. Lydia sensed the moment ripening like fruit in sun. She slipped from the room, granting privacy words could not. In the corridor, she rested her palm on worn wallpaper, counting heartbeats that were not hers. Rain began again, softer this time, tapping tin like small, patient fingers. Days lengthened. Grass pushed green tips through ash-colored soil. Lydia planted a half-handful of seeds near the porch, parsley, dill, a lone sunflower. Jacob watched from the steps, coat unbuttoned. He almost asked why, but the question felt clumsy. He simply fetched water each dawn, leaving the pail by the tiny plot. The doctor arrived in a rattling wagon, boots loud on the veranda. He carried the smell of camphor and certainty. Inside, he examined the old woman, made notes, spoke of inevitable decline. Jacob's jaw tightened. Lydia stood still, eyes on the doctor's hands, wondering how often they had closed lids. When he turned to leave, she pressed a loaf into his satchel. The gesture puzzled him. "Payment," she murmured, the first word she had offered in days. The doctor tipped his hat, left the loaf untouched until the horizon swallowed him. That night, the mother's fever broke. Sweat-soaked linen. Lydia and Jacob changed sheets together, moving as one mechanism. Lift, roll, smooth, tuck. Her breathing eased, deeper than before, yet fragile. Jacob touched Lydia's forearm in silent thanks. Her pulse jumped beneath his fingers. She did not pull away. Outside, frogs sang in roadside ditches, now swollen from spring melt. The porch chair swayed, though no one sat. Lydia stepped onto the boards, breathing damp wind that smelled of possibility. Jacob joined her, arms crossed to keep warmth close. Moonlight traced the scar on her wrist. She noticed his gaze and, after a long pause, turned the arm outward, letting him see. A burn, rope rough, newer than his grief yet old enough to fade at the edges. She did not explain. He did not ask. But the space between them shifted again, no longer guarded, merely waiting. Morning brought a clatter, tin pans striking floorboards. The mother's voice, thin but urgent. "Help!" Jacob stumbled into the kitchen to find Lydia braced against the stove, pan lid at her feet, vision swimming. He caught her before she fell, lowered her to a chair. Heat had stolen her strength, old wound throbbing beneath fresh effort. She squeezed his sleeve, refusing his panic. Water, shade, breath. She guided him with gestures until steadiness returned. When she finally spoke, the words were almost apology. "Too much fire," she said. Jacob nodded, poured cool water over a cloth, pressed it to her neck. Later, she rested on the porch while he burned the ruined bread outside, smoke curling into cloudless sky. He felt the loss keenly, not of crust, but of ritual. The house had learned to breathe through that daily rising scent. He vowed silently that tomorrow he would knead, though his hands had never mastered dough. Inside, Lydia slept, cheek against pillow striped by late light. Dawn came tangerine. Jacob stood at the table, flour like frost on his knuckles. Lydia guiding him without sound. Push, fold, turn. Her nods replaced language. He ruined the first ball, laughed once, sharp, surprised, alive. The sound startled them both, echoing through rafters like a bird released from a loft. She smiled, small and real. They set two loaves to rise. Jacob wrote a single word in the dusting of flour. Stay. Lydia brushed it away before it could sting, but the imprint haunted her palm. That afternoon, a wagon creaked up the lane. Relatives come to say farewell, grief already rehearsed on solemn faces. They found the house unrecognizable. Windows open, bread baking, the dying woman propped on pillows inhaling cinnamon air. She managed a nod, a half smile. The visitors faltered, unsure how to perform sorrow amid warmth. They left bouquets of dried lilies and promises to return when needed. The lilies withered further by evening. Lydia fed them to the stove, scent of brittle perfume swallowed by flame. Jacob watched the petals blacken, realized how near he had stood to that fate. Preserved for mourning, never living. He turned to Lydia, found her eyes reflecting ember glow. He started to speak, stopped, instead reached to dust ash from her sleeve. His thumb lingered. Night again. In the parlor, Lydia opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. For months she had drawn only emptiness. Now she traced the outline of a chair rocking in starlight, a battered fence, and two figures seated apart yet leaning unseen toward center. She shaded the space between them, darkest, so the eye would rest there, curious. Behind her, Jacob entered softly, carrying a mug of broth she had forgotten to drink earlier. He set it beside her, glanced at the drawing. A slow breath left him. He moved away, but she caught his hand, fingers closing with the certainty of someone mending something delicate. In the sick room, the old woman slept, chest rising in calm rhythm. Her dreams smelled faintly of bread and lavender. Beyond the windows, prairie grass swayed under a sky that promised nothing yet. Dawn seeped through the shutters like watered-down gold, spreading over the parlor floor board by board. Jacob woke to the smell of simmering oats, a softer scent than bread, but speaking the same promise. Nobody would face the morning empty. He found Lydia at the stove, hair loosely braided, cheeks flushed by steam. She stirred with slow, circular patience, the wooden spoon lifting grains the way a healer lifts a pulse, searching for steadiness. He poured 2 mugs of well water, slid one beside her. Their shoulders brushed, neither stepped away. Outside, prairie larks stitched their thin music through the hush, and the house, once brittle with despair, answered in small creaks, like bones aligning after a long sleep. The old woman woke early, eyes clearer than any day before. Lydia propped her upright, spooned the oats in measured swallows. Jacob watched hope rise and quake inside him, fearful to breathe too deeply lest it scatter. When his mother finished, she touched Lydia's wrist, bandage rough under papery fingers, then let her hand rest in her son's. 3 lives formed a frail triangle of warmth in the cool light. The fields called, fences needed paint, the roof needed tar. Jacob tied on his father's hat, brim split but still defiant, and set to work. Lydia stood at the porch, bandage fresh, sunlight glowing through the linen like a quiet flame. She raised a hand in salute, then turned to scrub floorboards until the grains shone honey-deep. At midday, she knelt in the garden patch, coaxing green nubs through crusted soil, her shadow braided with the sunflower's small silhouette, 2 fragile things gripping toward sky. When heat grew heavy, she rested under the porch awning and opened her sketchbook again. This time she drew the old woman's hands folding over Jacob's, lines etched with mercy rather than age. Mid-afternoon, Jacob returned, shirt damp, carrying a crate of apples discovered abandoned in the barn's cool corner. Most were withered, but a few held blush. Lydia rinsed them in a basin. The water turned ruddy with dust and time. She sliced the salvageable flesh, set a pot to bubble with cinnamon. The scent drifted past curtains, tugging the old woman into a doze thick with childhood harvests. Jacob tasted a spoonful, lips burning sweet. Memory cracked open. Autumns when his mother sang over canning jars, voice steady as the rolling prairie. He closed his eyes, hearing it almost whole. Lydia watched the tremor in his throat and understood without asking. By evening, the sky bruised purple. Wind carried a far-off whistle. Train tracks miles away, reminding them of endless elsewhere. Jacob rocked in the porch chair while Lydia planted a second row of seeds. He spoke at last, voice husky from disuse. Thought the garden died with Pa. She pressed soil over parsley roots. Things wait, she answered, four letters holding whole philosophies. He studied the bandage. You still waiting? Lydia sat back on her heels. I'm mending. She didn't elaborate. He didn't push. They let the wind finish the conversation, lifting dust into fading light. Inside, the old woman called softly. Jacob hurried, Lydia behind him. She asked for the window open. The air smelled of apple skins. Her fingers found Jacob's sleeve, tugged until he leaned close. No words came, only a long, searching gaze that poured decades of unsaid blessing into the space between heartbeat and breath. Jacob swallowed the ache rising, nodded once, promise forged without language. Lydia witnessed the exchange from the foot of the bed, palms pressed against the quilt's edge. She felt the room thicken with grace, fragile as moth wings yet mighty enough to steady rafters. In tat hush, she remembered her own mother, lost to fever 2 winters past, remembered kneeling by a straw-filled mattress, pleading for one more hour. Her throat tightened. She forced air steady, matching the old woman's slowed rhythm. Rain returned after midnight, gentle. It pattered across the roof like affectionate fingertips. Lydia sat at the kitchen table, lamp turned low, steam rising from herbal tea. She rolled back her sleeve, studying the scar, skin roped and pink, memory of a fire she had not escaped unscathed. The tea smelled of chamomile, but beneath it she caught faint phantom smoke, and her lungs clenched. She closed her eyes, counting 4 beats in, 4 beats out. The house listened, offering no judgment. Footsteps approached, Jacob barefoot, shirt untucked. He paused when he saw her hand open over the scar. His brow furrowed, more concern than curiosity. He reached for the kettle, poured water, sat opposite. Rain filled the silence so words didn't have to. After a time he spoke. Flames got Pa's barn once. Took half the horses. His voice shook. I know how they sound when wood screams. Lydia nodded, eyes on the tabletop's knot. I was inside a boarding house, she whispered. Oil lamp kicked. Narrow stairs, only one window low enough. She flexed her wrist, flame memory flickering. Jumped. He exhaled through teeth. Lucky. Half blessed, she corrected, managing a broken smile. They sipped in unison, tea cooling but comfort warm. Dawn's pale ribbon unspooled again. Jacob found his mother calmer, eyes bright. He helped her sit beside the window Lydia had cleaned spotless. Outside, the sunflower unfurled its first yellow tooth of petal. The old woman's lips curved, small but certain. Jacob felt something inside him settle. A stone lowered gently from shoulders. Work called. He rode to town for supplies, barn boards, and seed. At the mercantile, he overheard talk. The Carver farm was finally letting go. Folks ready to bid on land once the elder passed. Jacob straightened, fire snapping behind sternum. He purchased double what he'd planned, loaded the wagon high, and drove home with reins tight, resolve even tighter. Lydia met him at the gate. He handed her a bolt of blue calico without speaking. She unfolded it, fingers brushing fine weave. First new cloth to cross the threshold in years. She looked up. He shrugged awkwardly, color in his cheeks. Thought the curtains could do with brighter mornings? Her smile widened, genuine sunlight. They spent the afternoon hanging the fabric. Lydia stitched hems while Jacob drilled rods. By dusk, blue squares glowed in lamplight, and the house felt taller, almost proud. The old woman dozed beneath new curtains, breath steady. Lydia tucked a quilt around her, brushing silver hair back. Your boy's mending the world, she whispered, unsure if the words reached sleeping ears. Night brought a brittle chill hinting at passing cold front. Jacob stoked the stove, flames crackling. Lydia sliced the last of the good apples for pie. He watched her wrist move. Bandage gone now, scar open to air, yet no longer ruler of her motions. She caught him looking, lifted the forearm toward the fire's glow as though offering proof that wounds, fed enough warmth, lose the power to hush a life. He laid a gentle finger beside the scar, not claiming, simply acknowledging. Her breath shook once, then evened. In that silent moment, something new rooted. The pie cooled on the sill, scent drifting into the hallway where the old woman stirred. Jacob carried a slice to her, the crust flaking into his palm. She tasted, eyes closing in holy satisfaction. When she opened them, her gaze rested on Lydia standing mute at the doorframe. The elder's nod was small, but Jacob felt it thunder. Permission, maybe gratitude, maybe farewell. Later, when stars crowded the sky like 1,000 watchful seeds, Lydia stepped onto the porch. Jacob joined her, 2 cups of cider warming their hands. They sat in companionable hush, listening to the sunflower's stem creak as it swayed. Quiet testament that life, once coaxed, keeps insisting upward. Clouds slid across the half-moon, scattering silver across Jacob's face. Lydia turned, noticing lines softened, eyes less guarded. She thought, healing travels both directions, like warmth passed hand to hand along a loaf of bread. Inside, the old woman slept in linen that smelled of cinnamon and late-season rain. The house, no longer waiting for death, breathed like an old instrument tuned anew. Wind settled, crickets stilled. Somewhere far beyond sight, the night train's whistle sang of journeys. But here, on this porch, 2 hearts stayed, and for the first time in years, neither dreaded the dawn. Sun bled thin bronze across the prairie, aftertaste of an unhurried spring. Inside the house, the old woman's breath rasped a fraction shorter. Change had crept in overnight, sly as frost after thaw. Lydia felt it first, a subtle drag between each inhale, a hush that tasted of endings. She set broth to warm, though she doubted the spoon would lift often. Jacob fitted new shingles on the barn roof, hammer strikes crisp in morning stillness. From that height, he saw dust plumes twisting along the county road. 3 riders, coats too fine for field work, heading straight for the gate. He climbed down before questions could rise in his throat. The men dismounted with boots polished and voices clipped. They spoke of future subdivision, of fair compensation, of legal papers already waiting in town. Jacob kept arms loosely crossed, shoulders broad enough to block the doorway. Lydia appeared behind him, bandaged wrist hidden beneath rolled sleeve. Her presence, silent but solid, pushed against the businessmen's practiced confidence. One produced a ledger. Sales inevitable, son. Grief's a costly tenant. Jacob's jaw set. Lydia's fingers brushed his elbow. Steady. He answered with the calm of someone who had shoveled grave dirt and chosen to live anyway. Land spoken for. No further words. He shut the gate himself, the click ringing like a verdict. Inside, the encounter settled over the sick room. The old woman's eyes opened, clouded yet aware. Jacob knelt, spoke low about men and money and keeping promises. She squeezed his hand, strength of a sparrow yet binding. Lydia watched, mind already tallying the pantry, the seed stock, the timber left, resources of resistance. Afternoon heat rippled above the fields. Lydia sketched rows of fence posts, each one darker where Jacob's hands had steadied them. Across the margin, she penciled riders drawn small, then erased them until only faint ghosts remained. She closed the book, unwilling to let threats remain in ink. She joined Jacob in the garden, knees in dust, planting another line of beans. Sweat carved tracks through flour on his forearms from Dawn's baking attempt. He muttered about dough too wet. She answered with a soft laugh. The sound shook loose something lighter between them. Wind shifted, the sunflower's head now broader, tilting to follow daylight, cast mottled shade over Lydia's bandage. Jacob noticed the fabric fray and passed her a fresh strip torn from his own shirt hem. She bound the wrist new, not neat, then pressed the off-cut back into his palm. An unspoken exchange. What is torn can still serve. Near sunset, a single wagon rattled up. Same polished boots now shined with hurry. Behind them, a deputy's badge flashed dull copper. Paperwork, they said, was ready for an immediate claim on the property, citing unpaid debts. Jacob's pulse hammered. Lydia stepped forward first, voice level. Show the ledger. Numbers lined the page, but margins bore smudged alterations, ink still tacky in the fading light. She lifted one brow. The deputy's gaze faltered. Jacob read aloud a date that had not yet arrived. Fraud scrawled plain. Silence followed, stretched taut. Then the badge wearer cleared his throat, muttered about clerical confusion, and mounted up. The investors retreated under shrinking bravado, wagon wheels stuttering over ruts. When the dust settled, Jacob sagged against the gate, breath shaking with rage unspent. Lydia placed both palms on his shoulders, grounding him. In that touch, he felt the same calm she used to steady fevered skin, an assurance that storms pass, that walls can hold. He covered her hands with his. Night unfolded violet. Inside, the old woman drifted in shallow dreams. Lydia wiped her brow, then sat beside, humming a tune born far from these plains. Jacob repaired the kitchen window latch, each twist of the screwdriver a vow to keep what mattered intact. Later they shared coffee too strong, perched on the porch steps where lamplight met night. Crickets sang. Jacob spoke of boyhood rides with his mother to the river, her laughter echoing off canyon walls. His voice cracked once. Lydia's hand found the fragile curve of his knuckles, smoothing the tremor away. A shooting star carved the sky. She closed her eyes, whispered a wish he couldn't hear. When she opened them, tears shimmered unshed. He brushed a thumb beneath her eye, not wiping away sorrow, only acknowledging its place. The contact lingered just long enough for both to feel heat pulse between their ribs. Before dawn, a chill wind snuck through the house. The old woman stirred, her breasts now rattled, gap widening between. Lydia woke Jacob with a quiet knock. They sat on either side of the bed, hands linked across quilts, still faintly smelling of lavender. Gray light crept in. The dying woman's gaze drifted from son to nurse, landing finally on the sliver of sky between curtains, the place where morning waited. She exhaled once, soft as a lullaby. Silence followed, deep and solemn. Jacob's shoulders folded, chin dropping to chest. Lydia's fingers tightened around his, anchoring him while grief's wave struck. No words moved, only the porch chair creaked in distant wind, counting a heartbeat they could no longer hear in the room. They remained until sun edged the horizon, painting the sunflower's petals bright gold. Its head bowed under weight of bloom, mirroring the shape of Jacob's grief. Lydia rose first, drew linens over the still form with reverence. Then she lit a single beeswax candle, setting it on the sill where dawn struck flame, symbol that life, once given, keeps shining in borrowed light. Jacob stepped outside, air crisp, sky endless. He gripped the fence rail, breath clouding. Lydia joined, shoulder to his. For a long while they watched the prairie wake, larks lifting song, dew catching sun, the world insisting forward. When Jacob finally spoke, voice raw, it was a single word breathed more than said, "Stay." Lydia answered by threading her fingers through his, an answer stronger than promises, shaped by tongue. Behind them, smoke curled from the chimney, fire still tended. Ahead, farther than sight, riders and ledgers might return. But for this small circle, one house, one garden, two hearts, and a sunflower facing east, daybreak belonged entirely to the living. First light brushed the windows. Grief still pressed the rooms flat. Yet the house breathed on. Smoke from the stove rose in a calm blue thread. Lydia had kept the fire alive through the long night of vigil. Jacob stepped into the kitchen, eyes rimmed red, clothes still smelling of candle wax and farewell. She poured him water, slid the cup across the table, and waited. Silence settled heavy, but it did not suffocate. It wrapped them in recognition of what had been carried and what was yet to bear. They buried his mother at midday on the slight rise behind the barn, the place she once called her best view of spring. Wild asters nodded around the grave. Lydia laid a slice of the last apple pie atop the fresh earth, sweetness for the journey. Jacob planted the sunflower's tallest offshoot beside the marker, its stalk already bending toward light. No preacher spoke. The prairie wind carried all the scripture they needed. That evening, thunderheads gathered purple along the western rim. Jacob patched the final hole in the roof while Lydia secured shutters, their movements practiced, purposeful. As rain broke, they stood side by side beneath the eaves, water drumming a steady hymn. Each drop cooled the ache, smoothed sharp edges of memory, left behind a gentler outline. Weeks passed measured by small labors, rows hoed, fence boards straightened, linen aired until it smelled only of sun. Neighbors rode by, some to whisper condolences, others to pry about sale rumors. Jacob met them with a level gaze, hands resting easy on the gate latch. Lydia's presence at his shoulder answered any doubts. The farm would remain theirs, rooted, breathing, alive. At dusk they often sat on the porch, bread cooling between them, crust cracking like distant lightning. Conversation was sparse, but meaning thickened in the pauses. When she refilled his cup before he asked, when he tipped the chair just enough for her feet to rest on the rail. Their scars, one rope burn, one grief deep, no longer hid. They glinted in lamplight like faint constellations, mapping a shared sky. Summer's edge crept closer. The garden burst into disorderly grace, beans climbing rough stakes, parsley feathering over black soil. The lone sunflower split into 5 golden crowns. Children from the nearby settlement appeared one afternoon, lips sticky with curiosity, asking for seeds. Jacob knelt, handing out parcels of promise. Lydia showed how to press thumbprints in the dirt, how to cover gently, how to wait. On the longest day, Jacob hitched the wagon and drove Lydia down the ribbon road she had never traveled beyond the gate. Dust curled behind iron wheels as they passed amber fields, a silver river, and the distant freight line humming through open land. They stopped at a clearing where wild plums flooded the air with sugar. Jacob spread a blanket, set down a loaf still warm. They ate in unhurried bites, tasting freedom, tasting the courage it takes to stay. He pulled a small box from his coat, a wooden button carved from his mother's rocker, sanded smooth. No ring, no declaration, just the weight of memory turned into something that could be carried forward. He placed it in her palm, her fingers closed around it like soil around a seed. In the hush, promise found its shape without need of vows. When they returned, dusk painted the farmhouse copper. Lydia paused at the threshold, sensing the house lean toward them, as though hearts beat behind pine walls. Inside, she set the button on the mantel beside her sketchbook. Opening to a new page, she drew 2 silhouettes beneath a sunflower that towered like a quiet sun. For the first time, she inked her own smile, small, steady. The next morning she woke before dawn, kneaded dough beside Jacob, flour ghosting their forearms. As the first loaf rose, they stood close, foreheads nearly touching, listening to the yeast breathe promise into the crust. Outside, larks lifted up the day. Inside, the kitchen filled with a scent that once mended a household and now bound a future. They would face more ledgers, more winters, perhaps another fire. But the seed of staying had sprouted. Roots threaded through floorboards, through their ribs, through the prairie's patient heart. Together they would tend it, quiet hands working, silent love speaking loud in every small act. The bread finished just as sunrise struck the window. Lydia sliced the first heel, passed it to Jacob. Steam curled upward, incense for the living. They ate in peace, each bite a wordless chapter in the story they were still writing. If this tale found a place in your heart, tap subscribe, press like, and share in the comments which moment held you longest. Your voice keeps these stories riding the wind.